It's funny, I don't believe that this game tonight in New York is all that big a deal, if only because the standings really don't matter at this stage. But, I mean, come on. Good morning to you. Good Thursday morning. I'm Dejan Kovacevic of DK Pittsburgh Sports. This is Daily Shot of Penguins. It comes your way bright and early every weekday if you're into football and or baseball, and I'm here in St. Louis to cover the Pirates opener. I also offer daily shots of Steelers and Pirates, where you found this. Tonight at the Garden, 7:08 p.m. face-off. It is Penguins versus Rangers again, and it's the Penguins looking yet again to recreate what they had in beating the Rangers in the first meeting by that beautiful score of 1-0. And if they don't, again, it's not going to hurt you in the standings. The Capitals are a mile behind. You're pretty much locked into where you are. The Rangers could continue moving up and overtake the Hurricanes, but that really is something that the Penguins can't control one way or the other. If they end up facing the Hurricanes in the first round, I mean, it's one tough challenge or another. It's not going to make much of a difference. But where I think it is meaningful, in fact, that it is pretty much a bellwether game, is that it's going to be the last hard sight that you see. And more important, that the Penguins players themselves experience, it'll give you some sense of whether or not they can really pull this off in the playoffs on a game after game after game basis. And by pull this off, I of course mean getting back into opponents' faces and shutting them down, frustrating them, exasperating them, having their coaches and their captains say afterward, man, that team came at us just way too hard. Remember all of that stuff from the first half of the season? Well, this is it. There's 11 games left. Look at the rest of the schedule. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't good teams on it. The Capitals are going to be the next opponent on Saturday. But I am saying that from the standpoint of facing someone that's fast, that counterattacks, that hurts you on the transition, like both the Rangers and the Hurricanes do, this is it. This is your tune-up. And you don't have to wonder whether or not one team or the other is going to show up. Because for obvious reasons, it's going to be just as big a deal to those guys as it is to these guys. This is what Jeff Carter had to say yesterday after practice.
I think we still have some work to do, but I think these last three games in particular, obviously the last two didn't go our way, but I think our games really come along, and I think playing the Colorados and the Minnesotas that are top teams in the league, I think it's made us elevate our game, and I think we started getting to another level. So another big one tomorrow, and we just keep building on it.
Big game. Tone setter of a game, no matter who you face in the first round. This portion of Daily Shot of Penguins is brought to you by the good people at the Greater Pittsburgh Community Food Bank, where they're committed to providing food for all of our neighbors in need across Western Pennsylvania. They, in turn, need your help. Find out how $1 can be turned into 5 full meals. For those in need, visit pittsburghfoodbank.org. Now, when I talk about these things as if they're challenges being put forth to the Penguins, it's pretty easy to pick up that I'm principally pointing at the skaters, because they've been the issue, for better or worse, over the course of this season. The one guy that I almost never mention in any negative context, and I think rightly so, is Tristan Jarry. I think he's earned that. I think he's had maybe over the span of these several months, one or two games where you'd say, wow, yeah, he really hurt us tonight. I don't even know if it's that many. There's been some games, kind of like the one a couple nights ago against the Avalanche, where you'd say, all right, I mean, if he'd made a couple more saves, there would have been some kind of prayer of staying with it, and maybe there'd be more of a reward for all the shots on goal that the Penguins did generate at the other end on Darcy Kemper. But you wouldn't say Jarry was bad either. Well, here's another variable to put on top of the pile. Because let's recall that the one time the Penguins did beat the Rangers in that 1-0 game, the predominant factor, as tremendously as the Penguins played all over the rink, was still that Jarry outperformed Igor Shesterkin. And Shesterkin was really, really, really good. That's got to be part of this equation as well. And we're getting closer to the real games and the real test. And by the way, the real questions that start getting asked anew about Jarry. It's wonderful what he's done to date. It really is. There's nothing that can erase it. A great regular season is a great regular season. But you know and I know that if he's anything less than that same level, in not just in the playoffs, but in game one of the playoffs, it's going to be a real focal point. The first mistake he makes, the first pass he tries to someone, especially if it's up the middle, that stuff's going to pop up again. It just is. So let's not leave him out of this scenario either, because this is where he has a chance to plant another flag, like he did in the first meeting with Shesterkin, like he's done in a lot of big-time head-to-head matchups with the other goaltender all season. I don't have a feel for this. I like to think that I do, especially after being around the team all year long and everything, and just having covered the game a couple nights ago back in Pittsburgh. But every time I think I sense a trend, particularly a negative trend, this team does bounce back. This team does come out with a performance like, for example, the one that we saw a week ago in St. Paul. I didn't see that. I probably should have. After the disappointing defensive showing the other night against the Avs, it's kind of easy to have that same feel for this one. But this is different. This is different. The Penguins and the Rangers have been lining up for quite a while. Both teams are aware. Both teams are going to be braced for it. There's no way to replicate that in any kind of setting against a Western Conference opponent. It's going to be fun. More than anything, it's going to be fun. When we come back, J1Q. And today's J1Q comes from Tim, who asks, hey DK, last year it seemed like Mike Sullivan felt his hands were tied at the goalie position. I thought Tristan Jarry should have been pulled in the first period of Game 6, and even the Zamboni driver would have been better. Even with Jarry rebounding the kind of season he's had, do you see Sullivan sticking with him if he falters? Well, Tim, I'm going to ask you something back. Who would you put in? What would you do? The Penguins have put themselves into a position with the salary cap in particular where they can barely make moves internally, much less externally. Some of that is predicated on money and cap space. Some of it is predicated on the plain and simple number of moves you're allowed to make related to Wilkes-Barre Scranton. But whatever the scenario is now, how they arrived at it is how they arrived at it, and they're stuck with it. I don't believe you're going to see Louis Domingue in Pittsburgh, barring an injury, for the remainder of this regular season. And that, to me, is a mistake. And I'm not saying this after the fact. If you're a regular listener, you'll know that I brought this up even before Louis' one game, his one stellar game in San Jose. They needed to have him in that mix for the backup goaltender's job. It never should have been, and still shouldn't be, getting bequeathed to Casey DeSmith as if he's the only other goaltender on earth. There is very little, not nothing, but very little in DeSmith's cumulative performance over this season that should give anybody confidence that he could be the guy that would come in and stabilize things if Jarry were to go south. And I definitely don't mean to imply that Domingue would be the equivalent of Jarry at his best if he were to come in his place, but I don't think he'd be the equivalent of pouring gasoline onto the fire either. And that is kind of how I feel about DeSmith. And this, I kind of feel it's important to add, is one of the many things I haven't liked about the internal roster management over the full season that we've seen as it applies to Wilkes-Barre. No, they're not exactly stacked down there. The closest any individual prospect has come to even having a burst where you'd say, wow, got to bring that guy up, has been recently, and in a pretty upbeat development organizationally, Sam Poulin been scoring a bunch of goals. But between Domingue and P.O. Joseph and Drew O'Connor, there have been players that you could have seen coming up and competing for actual roster spots where they would have been better, more productive than the guys who are now here and essentially stuck on this roster. And this is not ideal, and one of many things that has me cringing a little bit as these playoffs come up. That you haven't had that big surprise player. You haven't had that surge that comes up from the young guys that we've seen in recent championship seasons. It's just the same dudes going out there again and again and again and not scoring. And that's not something that tends to, snap its figurative fingers and make everything okay. I appreciate the question. I appreciate everyone listening to Daily Shot of Penguins. We will talk about the Rangers game tomorrow.